So thank you very much all for joining. I think this is something like episode 12 of Street Drugs Discussions, and that's actually following something of an accidental winter hiatus. We did intend to have a December one. We then realised that nobody really wanted a January one, so we are now back in February. So thank you very much all for joining. So I will ask you to introduce yourselves in a minute, but we have on the subject of anabolic steroids, we have Katinka van der Ven, we have Jim McVeigh and Mark Thompson. So thank you very much all for joining. Thank you very much as ever, James and Alex at Drug Science, for organising everything in the background. So thank you for that. To begin with, so Katinka, welcome. Thank you very, very much for joining us. So could you please, actually, as well as telling us what you're doing at the moment, your major research agendas, perhaps tell us what. So today's focus is on steroids. If you could maybe start by saying a little bit more about what IPED and image and performance enhancing drugs are, kind of what the field likes to look at, and what you have been looking at most recently.
Yeah, of course. Well, hello everyone, and also thank you, James, for inviting me to be part of this podcast. So performance and image enhancing drugs are substances that are used to improve body image or to enhance performance, and this includes a wide variety of substances, but the main substance that is used are anabolic steroids. But often what we see is that they are used in combination with other enhancement substances as well. And that's what we're, one of the things that we're going to focus on today. I will tell a little bit about myself as well. So I'm a senior lecturer at the University of New England and a research fellow at the Drug Policy Modeling Program at the University of New South Wales. I'm also a director of the Human Enhancement Drugs Network and the editor-in-chief of Performance Enhancement and Health. It's a bit of a mouthful, I know, but anyway, that's me. I'm often invited as an expert or consultant for various projects or for government agencies. So, for example, actually recently I provided expert advice for a court case in New South Wales in which a young man unfortunately died of using non-prescribed insulin. And then they, of course, also noticed that he was using other substances as well, including steroids. Anyway, I've been doing research on non-prescribed anabolic steroid use and other enhancement substance use since 2012, which is when I was starting my PhD. And most of my initial work was actually really focused on the illicit supply of steroids. Who supplies them, what are their motivations, methods what methods are used to distribute these substances, the quality of these substances, and so on. And I actually also realized that quite soon I realized that these substances had little priority in most countries. So both in terms of the regulation of illicit supply, as well as providing health services to people who experience issues from their use. And some of the reasons, why it tends to have less priority is that we don't really see direct harms from the use of these substances compared to other illicit substances. So, for example, we do not see people, overdosing on the street from using steroids. We do not see people becoming extremely violent from using these substances. And prevalence numbers are not extremely high, despite other indicators that there is a growing group of drug users. There's also issues with methodologies. But anyway, just to say that, these are just some of the reasons why organizations are often less willing to provide, funding to take action in this area. So it actually is pretty hard to get research going in this area, although luckily in the last couple of years it is getting more and more traction, and also in terms of governments taking action, especially actually in the UK, a lot of amazing work is being done. So I started to become more and more interested in doing research on the use of these substances, particularly in relation to improving health services to people who use non-prescribed steroids. So actually a recent example of a project that I finished last year was the GP Guide to Harm Minimization for patients who are using non-prescribed steroids and other performance and image enhancing drugs, which I developed with several other colleagues. I'm now actually going to put a link to that guide in this chat, just so if you're interested, can have a look at it. I also put some other links in there as well. So this project involves working with GPs, other healthcare professionals, consumers, and stakeholders in developing a tool that could assist GPs in improving their knowledge of these substances and their engagement with and management of this patient group. Actually, what is a pretty big deal for me is that the New South Wales Ministry of Health has actually approached us and wants to endorse this guide, which is a huge achievement. Anyway, but this actually also links right away back to one of the issues that is playing in this field. There's very few prevention and harm reduction resources available in this area. The ones that do exist are generally not evaluated for their effectiveness. Harm reduction information is often too one-sided. There are very few health professionals that have adequate knowledge of these substances to support this group. Consumers often do not trust health professionals and generally tend to get information elsewhere. And these are just a couple of examples of issues that need to be resolved in this area. Anyway, back to my work. So I'm basically, one of the things that I'm really focused on now is trying to improve this, and by developing and evaluating resources, bringing people together to get projects started, providing workshops about steroids to help professionals and so on. I'm currently working on a project focused on men who use non-prescribed steroids as a form of testosterone replacement therapy, which is, we're currently in the process of applying for ethics, so that's really still in the beginning stages. And that project is led by Dr. Matthew Dunn. And finally, I also do a lot of work in the broader alcohol and other drug treatment space. So for example, I'm currently conducting an evaluation of an Aboriginal residential treatment program in Queensland. And actually doing this broader work in the addiction and treatment space also helps my research in the steroid space. Anyway, that's enough about me. I'm very excited to get this discussion started.
Thank you very, very much, Katinka. Actually, one quick question before we move on. So I believe you started off in the criminology department. What would you say your approach is now? Are you still a criminologist? Is it public health, or what would you say your approach, your discipline is for this?
Well, yeah, I am, currently part of the criminology department, and my original work has been very much, supply is definitely, comes from a criminological angle, but a lot of my work is now also geared towards public health. But I find it always, to be honest, I hate these labels, and I just, do research and, have different perspectives and, different disciplinary backgrounds into, in which I do work. But yeah, I'm definitely at home in the public health area. I just noticed that someone said that the link is not working, so I'll just send the link in a second again.
Ah, excellent. Okay, thank you very, very much for that. So now we'll move on to an introduction opening gambit from Professor Jim McVeigh. So Jim, I believe you are from a public health background, and I believe you also have some slides which you have shared. So thank you very, very much for that. And so, yeah, Jim, please tell us about what you do and what you've been doing most recently.
Great. The slide showing, and can you hear us okay? Great. Yeah, I'm Jim McVeigh, Professor of Substance Use and Associated Behaviours at Manchester Met. I've been interested in this field for the last 30 years, and I sort of stumbled into it from a practitioner's point of view, working as a nurse practitioner in a needle and syringe program. We suddenly started seeing lots of large people coming in, which reignited my interest from a previous life where I knew a lot of doormen. So that's how I stumbled into this. Katinka set things up very well in relation to the evidence base for effectiveness of interventions. It is really barren in the UK. Until last year, the last national study was 1993. So there hasn't been a huge amount of investment, but there has been now investment from NIHR. I'm going to talk about that. This was a small development grant that we got, and I'll go over that, and I'll just mention some collaborative work that we're doing with these very smart people in Oslo. Let's see if this will work. So yeah, this is an NIHR study as a development grant, and we've now submitted application for a larger grant on the back of that. The NIHR work, while it was only small, we managed to get most of the best people in the UK involved, with the universities of Manchester Met, Liverpool John Moores, Birmingham, and Bath, and Michael Linnell working it, and also a really strong steering committee. And probably most importantly of all, our public expert advisory board, who were there at all stages to steer, influence, guide, and give sanity checks to the work that we were doing, and making sure that it was appropriate and applicable for the target population, which is obviously key to any public health work. So, I mean, the overall purpose of the NIHR work was to find out what's effective and cost effective, but there needs to be a lot of groundwork done before that. So we identified these objectives. To be able to measure any impact, we need to know the size of an issue, and there isn't good data around prevalence. So we wanted to improve that. We wanted to see, another thing NIHR insist on is that you're not duplicating work. So we need to see what was out there and what was out there in relation to the UK. What services were out there, and a piece of work that hadn't really been done, which is really thoroughly explore what influences harmful use of iPad use. It was all specific to the UK. Why? Because we're different. We're very different. We have a unique approach to legislation in as much as we have very severe offences for tariffs for supply, and yet it's perfectly legal to possess for personal use. And this was set up in '96 and has been ratified since then, with the reason of it not wishing to criminalise large numbers of mostly men. Although why that doesn't apply to other drugs, I'm not quite sure. And the other reason is so that it wouldn't act as a barrier to service engagement. The other thing we've got is really high level of service engagement for people who use iPads with needle and syringe programs. Still not high enough, but certainly high compared to most countries in the world. So say we don't know the prevalence. We have had some estimates which are delivered regularly by the Crime Survey for England and Wales. But I think, and as the ACMD have recognised and politely termed it as, they are weak. There are a lot of flaws in this, and we know that, you know, year on year changes where things estimates double. It shows that volatility, that, you know, there's problems with it. Plus, when we look at the numbers of people engaged in needle and syringe programs, neither of those figures are viable. So there's a need for a pragmatic approach to what a likely range was. Too ambitious for a piece of work like this to be able to deliver firm estimates, but we need to estimate the ballpark. Basically, how wrong is the Crime Survey for England and Wales? We based this on a number of things. We have some data for needle and syringe programs. We had that. We had our iPad National Survey, which involves, there was 4 or 5 sweeps of around about 400, 800 people in each. So some decent numbers. Crime Stoppers and a major provider of private sales of injecting equipment gave us anonymized data as well, mostly to feed into the shape, as in what is the distribution regionally, so that we got some anchor points for needle and syringe programs. What we didn't know is if they're representative nationally. So from those data that we had, we were able to generate some estimates, but then we used a Delphi panel, which is a group of a range of experts from different backgrounds, and in this case, with a good proportion of people with lived experience, who were able to tell us and inform some of the multipliers when we came to do the estimates around what proportion of men who were injecting use needle and syringe programs, what proportion only are using orally, and what regional variations there may be. All these things to combine to be able to provide us with some estimates or estimated ranges. So we came up with 2. One of them was between 289 and 569 men using on an annual basis. The other one, 328 to 687. The other two estimates generated from the crime survey for England and Wales, the Delphi participants, a few of them thought that the 62,000 was probable. None of them thought that 31,000, but most of them felt that one of our ranges, and in particular the larger range, was the higher estimate. So from that, we can see that the consensus is that the estimate we were coming up with, that range, is 10 times higher than the crime survey for England and Wales, which, if nothing else, justifies the need for investment to be able to look at more detail around prevalence. I'll skip over a couple of these things. The review of the literature we conducted, again focusing on the UK because it's specific to the UK, found a good range of qualitative, quantitative and review material, mostly from peer-reviewed journals. And a lot of that work was descriptive around the population themselves or descriptive of the interventions. But none of this was around effectiveness evaluations. There was no robust evaluations of effectiveness. One of the common features, certainly over the last couple of years of the stuff that's been published, is this need for co-production and involvement of the user population. Again, for those people working within psychoactive drug use, this may seem as an automatic. This was actually is an important step and recognition that the need for anything that we do with this population must involve them. We looked at the interventions that were out there, again, through various sources, including our own networks. And we asked the various programs out there. As it turned out, it was all needle and syringe programs or services based around needle and syringe programs. And we were able to see that most of those were providing information. There were very few dedicated clinics providing health monitoring or associated outreach services. So very few specialist services, basically. Final thing I'll mention around the NIHR was around the systems analysis. And this is using a different approach to probably a common way of approaching things. Basically, we normally get to this point where we do a load of either interviews and focus groups, and we identify key features that come out, in this case, around what influences harmful use, and then we cluster them. What we did with this, though, was we mapped them out, because quite often when you come to those results, we look at them in isolation. And the key thing over developing out interventions and being able to evaluate them is seeing where you put that intervention in. And to do that, you need to see how these different factors interrelate. Now, you can't actually see that in any detail. I've got the link there for you to go in and hopefully have a mess around with this. Basically, if you hover over any of those spots, any of those 50 odd factors, you see what it links in with, what has a positive reinforcing and what has a negative reinforcing. Basically, so that you'll know that if you intervene somewhere, it will impact somewhere else. And to be able to develop interventions and evaluate them, we need that kind of work. So we finished that work now. We've published the literature review, the estimate ranges that's under review at the moment, and the systems work is just about to be submitted. So that should be out shortly. And all this information you can find on the ASUK website, anabolicsteroids.org.uk. Just one final thing, I've got a couple more minutes, James, is just work with the Norwegians, and collaborative is probably a bit of a stretch. They allow me to join in with their really fantastic work. And one of these projects was looking at those people who are in drug treatment, so substance use dependence drug treatment. So for us in the UK, that would be structured drug treatment for opiate use primarily, but also for stimulant use. But what they did was they had a look to see how many of those people had used anabolic steroids, and it's something we've never systematically done. Well, NDTMS should pick that up. It's all down to how you ask the questions. It's never really been looked for in this country. And what they found was a really high level, 28% of their substance use dependent clients or patients had used anabolic steroids. And a significant proportion of that, it was in response to the effects of their psychoactive drug use, in particular weight loss. And I think prison is probably a key element within this and needs to be picked out further. The other thing I just wanted to briefly mention was that their work around dependence. We've got a clear evidence to identify that there is dependence among this group. What this work did was it looked at the groupings and the clusters of different levels of dependence, and what those associated factors were, and they saw things to do with personality features, emotional control, reduced empathy, impulsivity, and this is, it makes perfect sense, but the work had never been done before. This feeds into their wider brain story, which hopefully they're going to adopt that as the title for their research group. They've identified changes to the structure and the functioning of the brain in relation to anabolic steroids, and they're world leading in that area. They're also doing work around the management of hypergonadism, and also a focus on work with women. So the work that's coming out of Norway at the moment is really significant and has real global importance. So thanks for that.
Thank you very, very much for that, Jim. And so yeah, there's certainly a few areas there I will go back to interrogate later. One actually question now. So the very interesting finding about high levels of steroid use amongst substance dependent visitors to services. Is there any indication if it's occasional or persistent and prolonged steroid use from this group?
Certainly for some of them there is. And again, it works in both directions for where people have used either prior to opiate use. But the key thing for me was this significant proportion of people who already have psychoactive drug use problems adopting anabolic steroid use and habitual use around that to either manage or to combat some of the negative impacts of that sustained use.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's something I had wondered before. I once interviewed someone who had been a heroin user for many, many years, but also he claimed to provide muscle to an organized crime group and said that the steroids were very much to balance the heroin and make sure he was still of professional use in that role. So yeah, very interesting to find that. But yeah, we'll definitely come back to you again to some issues of prevalence, but I will now bring in Mark. So Mark, we have a different perspective on this. So Mark, a colleague of mine at London Met, Mark is a sports psychologist. So when I'll bring it back, I'll be very interested to hear back from Jim and Katinka about the proportion of steroid users who are doing so in a sporting context. But now we'll move over to Mark for the sporting context. So Mark, if you could please introduce yourself and tell us about the research that you've been doing.
But hello, everyone. So for those of you that don't know me, my name is Dr. Mark Thompson. I'm a senior lecturer here at London Met University alongside James. And I guess my speciality really is within sports psychology. So I do a lot of work with athletes in terms of their appraisals of stress and emotions and their sporting performance, but also as well alongside that, I've always been keenly interested in the world of anti-doping within sport. And I guess since 2014, my PhD was funded by the World Anti-Doping Agency. And since then, I've had the privilege of working on research funded projects by, again, World Anti-Doping Agency, the International Olympic Committee. This provided me a lot of opportunities of working in professional elite sport within, say, football league clubs in England, Rugby Super League, rugby union, and also a lot of, sports governing bodies as well. Now, I'm just going to, let's try again. There we go. Okay, so before we get into this, I'm just going to provide you, I guess, with a quick bit of background into the current scene of doping in sport. Now, we're in a bit of a funny place here, really, with doping, as drug tests have actually never been more accurate. They tend to have an accuracy of around 1 in 1 billion, which I guess is akin to being able to detect a tablespoon's worth of drugs dropped into an Olympic-sized swimming pool. It's like a shark smelling blood, if you will. And yet, whilst we're at that point, there's been a lot of issues in terms of the amount of people we expect to be taking drugs, and also what has been actually found. So you can see here, WADA have been putting, millions and billions of pounds into testing each year. And from that rigorous testing, they typically find 1 or 2% of drug tests positive in an average year. However, it doesn't really tend to tell, I guess, the entire story. So biological passport research has suggested that this could actually be as high as 14%, whilst more recently, and I guess quite concerningly, there was, a controversial paper by Ulrich in 2018, who used a double-blind research question provided to athletes at the Pan-Arab Games. I think it was in Doha, and also a games in South Korea as well. And they found that up to 43.6% of athletes had actually knowingly used banned substances within the past year. Now, some scholars have called into question that figure, but it's clear that there is a substantial difference between what suspected doping levels are and what, say, WADA or the IOC or UKAD catch each year. So I guess in a lot of ways as well, as a psychologist, I would also question whether we're actually even asking the right question here. So, I mean, even if we were to catch the actual level of people taking performance enhancing drugs, the damage is already, the damage has already been done to both the athlete, their competitors, and also the sport at whole. So if we think about this, firstly, the damage has already been done to the athlete's body from taking these sorts of, extreme substances, elevating their growth hormone or their testosterone levels to, life-altering levels. Then as well, even if we capture this athlete taking steroids, and we disqualify them, and we award their medal to, say, the silver medal person, that could be years down the line, that wonderful moment in which that clean athlete has been working towards, that isn't going, you can't replicate that moment when they finally get given their gold medal in some car park. That's a life's amount of work that's been tarnished by someone else's actions, not to mention the potential risk that they've been put at if they're having to physically compete against someone that has been taking things such as human growth hormone. And finally, as well, each, I guess, positive test damages the integrity of sport, both to the competitors and to the people who watch it as well. I mean, there's almost this, I guess, this paradox that may actually encourage that silver medalist to consider doping more, as they then perceive their chances to win in the next championships to be higher, because they're going to think, well, clearly everyone's at it. I may as well be at it as well if I'm going to have a chance of actually winning and fulfilling my athletic dreams. So it's clear to me that the prevention is better than the cure, and that's why associations such as WADA and IOC have put money into research grants that allow people such as myself to do what I do and come up with a proactive rather than a reactive response. So what you see on screen here is the revised sport drug control model for adolescent athletes. Now, this is something that I, with my my PhD supervisor, put together over a number of years. This originally started as a qualitative project. I interviewed people around the world, so elite level sporting coaches that coached elite adolescent athletes. And then from that, we created this model, which has then obviously been revised through further research within elite sport. And here on screen, you'll see a number of factors that are associated with attitudes towards doping and also susceptibility towards doping. Now, I picked this model for a number of reasons. Obviously, one, it highlights the research I do, but also adolescence is the age where key attitudes and values towards drug-taking behavior are formed, and also as well, propensity for risk-taking behavior and impulsivity tend to be at their highest within the lifespan. So I'll go through each of these constructs very quickly now. Firstly here, we have threat and benefit. Now, if there are any psychologists in the room, you may be familiar with Lazarus's cognitive motivational relational theory, and you'll be aware that these are stress appraisals. So within this context, the athlete considers the threat to take in performance enhancing drugs, you know, the threat of being caught, the threat that may happen towards their health. And also as well, they consider the benefit, you know, that they may, you know, it's a cost benefit way up, if you will. I don't want to focus too much on the factorial loadings, otherwise we'll just be here all day, but you can see that threat hasn't tended to significantly I guess influence one's attitudes towards doping, but you can see that benefit actually has there. Then we have self-esteem, which has a negative relationship there with attitudes, which makes sense. It's never a happy athlete that dopes. In that sense, when we relate it to something like threat, for example, you know, these are constructs that, you know, can be interlinked. Self-esteem, you know, doping can be seen as almost a maladaptive coping strategy. It's not a great one, but it is still a strategy. Then we have cheating, which can be related to morality, I guess, the distortion of an athlete's responsibility in having integrity within their sport. You know, if an athlete ultimately believes that everyone is taking performance enhancing drugs, then that idea of them taking performance enhancing drugs may seem a lot less immoral. They might have, you know, well, everyone's at it, so I'm not being that bad. I'm just giving myself that chance to win. Then we have legitimacy, which relates to the idea that you know, our organizations such as the IOC and WADA and UCAD are serious in combating PED usage, and that PED users will be caught. And finally, you know, arguably, you know, certainly one of the most important constructs is that of the reference group. So that relates to people of importance to the athlete in question, whether that's their coach, whether that's their parents, whether that's their guardian, whether that's their fellow athletes, and so on. And what we can see from this is not only does it obviously linked on here to attitudes towards doping, but it's significantly related to susceptibility to doping as well. So I guess I guess a very key example of this, very prominent and recent example, is Kamila Valieva. I'm sure most of you couldn't have actually escaped the news recently, but she's the 15-year-old figure skater from Russia. And it's something I would be interested in hearing from both my colleagues on this webinar, and also just like the audience on this webinar, because it's been very interesting and I guess low-key appalling in terms of, say, that the coverage that has been applied to Camilla. You know, this is a person who is still legally a child, who most likelihood would have had little to absolutely zero knowledge of the substances that she was being influenced or even given to take by her coaches or her guardians to look after her. And she's an exact you know, example of this direct link from reference group to susceptibility in doping. And I guess she's someone I actually feel incredibly sorry for. However, she certainly isn't an isolated case. So recently, a systematic review that I helped conduct has suggested that anabolic steroid use can actually occur in child athletes before their 10th birthday. So I guess clearly then, in order to how we consider to best tackle doping in sport, it can't be athletes who we solely focus on. The reference group of the people of importance of around them are also incredibly important too. And I guess as well, we should also perhaps consider how that taking of PD is labeled. It's all too easy to call someone like Camilla a cheat when really, you know, she's the victim of a much larger system that tends to prioritize athlete performance over well-being. So it's these sorts of models, I guess, that have really started to change anti-doping interventions and research. And there is actually a lot of promise as we move forward here. So I guess the biggest project of my career that I've been involved with was a large grant here by the IOC for I Play Clean. Now, I Play Clean is a multimodal anti-doping intervention that we aimed at high-level adolescent athletes. Within I Play Clean, I designed face-to-face and website-based interventions based on obviously the most very recent anti-doping research, based on the most recent pedagogy research as well. So we've got things such as gamification-based exercises, both in person and on the website. We've got even a short film involved in this intervention as well. And what I did, I managed a team of facilitators, and we went into elite and high-level academies and sporting clubs across the UK, and we measured the influence of I Play Clean against doping propensity across a 12-week period. So this was a 1,000 athlete 3 time point interventional study. And what we found was that I Play Clean significantly reduced doping propensity, and it's now in use in a number of clubs, sporting clubs across the Football League and in all 12 Rugby Super League clubs. So other research as well is also currently being conducted, I guess, to look at some of those individual constructs that I mentioned earlier in the sport drug control model. I'm currently working with a colleague at Canterbury Christchurch University, Philip Hurst, to, I guess, investigate the, how can I put it, the malleability, I guess, of morality and how this may ultimately then link to doping propensity. This is also linked as well, as you can see here, the dark triad of personality traits. For those of you that aren't aware of the dark triad, this is psychopathy, Machiavellianism, and also narcissism, to see how these personality traits can actually predict doping propensity and maybe behavior as well. Obviously, I made a big thing earlier there of reference groups. So obviously as well, I think moving forward, there's a real focus for them to see, I guess, how the general attitudes towards PED use in say parents or guardians and coaches, how important that is. So I'd be very interested in perhaps conducting some, say, qualitative research there. And also as well, what you can take from this if you are a parent or guardian or a coach or even an athlete, I guess your role in the fight against PED usage has actually already begun, because the attitudes and the behaviors that you undertake may ultimately have a huge influence on those that look up to you. Now, I guess as well, moving forward, I've got a few different ideas, because what I found when I was going into these sporting clubs, these elite, these academies, what I often found is a lot of anti-doping education that athletes tend to come across has typically focused on that threat aspect, the damage that will be done to your body or to your reputation or to your sport if you doped and you got caught. But if you remember from the sport drug control model there, we actually didn't have a significant link there from threat to attitudes towards doping individually. So athletes can often think that, especially at that age where they feel invincible, that the risk of taking PEDs is worth the reward, where actually, if you're an athlete and all you've ever dreamed of is, winning the gold medal or winning the Premier League or whatever, would you take the risk to your health to, I guess, essentially make history to achieve that one goal that's almost defined your identity, defined your life? I think a lot of youth athletes would certainly say yes to that. They believe that the juice is actually worth the squeeze. So when you're going in to these clubs, I guess this is more anecdotally, but I've definitely seen athletes where they would certainly consider, even though they have been told of the damage that PEDs may do to their body. It's almost like anti-smoking interventions. If children to still smoke because it's cool, and to hell with the threat of it. And I guess that's why I've actually recommended focusing on these last 2 points, these last 2 bullet points. So firstly, qualitative research. As I've alluded to there, I actually think there's a huge identity aspect, almost existential, for why an athlete might dope in order to achieve everything they've ever dreamed of achieving. And also as well, I think it's actually more feasible to conduct qualitative research in this sense. It's very difficult to get a large number, a good powered study to measure doping behavior where athletes may consider telling, may be honest about their potential PED usage. But I think it'd be much easier to get a small proportion of individuals who are willing to discuss their PED usage and how that related to the constructs, one within the sport drug control model, but also perhaps deeper constructs as well in terms of their own sporting and personal identity. And finally, I've put a pretty generic point there, positive psychology. I mentioned earlier that it's arguably never a happy athlete who dopes. Now, outside of doping, I've actually conducted some longitudinal positive emotional research, which involved the broaden and build theory of positive emotions. And that theory, in essence, suggests that single experiences of pleasant emotions can promote what we would call an upward spirals within athletes, signs of flourishing, which are related to, high levels of resilience that are related to more adaptive coping behaviors than, say, maladaptive coping behaviors, such as taking performance enhancing drugs. So this got me wondering, is like, could we actually, through the promotion of things such as self-esteem, of good, strong personal resource levels, of high levels of resilience, that actually could some of the best anti-doping education actually not even mention anti-doping? Could it be that if we actually build athletes, personal coping resource levels and their emotional levels, that actually, if they're placed into a situation where they may consider taking performance enhancing drugs, they don't feel like they have to rely on a maladaptive coping strategy. And I think that involves really looking at the situations where an athlete might take steroids. If you look at, say, the average 16-year-old that may be competing for an academy contract, and all of a sudden they get injured, and that's a very difficult situation to be in, and taking performance enhancing drugs to recover quicker, it almost seems logical, I guess, to a 16-year-old there. So or perhaps an 18-year-old who is influenced, whose parents are looking at a potential university scholarship and may highlight to their child that actually this could be a good course of action to take. If you actually promote those personal resource levels through positive psychological interventions, that maybe they will have the ability to, that have that broadened attention span, where they can actually consider different avenues for them to take, and also to have that resilience to say no to that person in influence. So I think there's a lot of really exciting avenues here within anti-doping through positive psychological interventions. And I'd certainly welcome any comments or collaborators as I look to explore this over the coming months. I don't want to give too much away, but I've got some exciting ideas. So thank you for listening. Obviously, I'd welcome any questions that you have. And also as well, if you do wish to get in contact, my email is on the screen there.
Thank you very, very much for that, Mark. And yes, please. So we actually haven't got any questions to anyone in the chat or Q&A, so please put them there. Although luckily I've got about 7 on my mind. Actually, I think Katinka has one as well that you wish to fire straight towards Mark.
Yes, I do. Thanks so much. Well, to be honest, I have questions for James, for Jim. Sorry, I call you James because that's the name in your little chat box. But for James, for Jim and Mark, I'm sorry. So I'll start with Mark, and I think thank you both for this really interesting presentation. I was actually thinking of 2 questions, and I hope if that's okay, James. And I was actually, when I was listening to your presentation, Mark, I really focused on the athlete and the factors that influence the behavior of the athlete. And I was just thinking of Jim's model, where he showed the various factors and the different layers to what can, in that sense, influence harm. But in this case, you could argue about what can influence doping behavior. And especially that we now know also that, the culture around the athlete is very important. Do you think it potentially would be beneficial actually to map out all these different things outside of the athlete that potentially can influence that doping behavior as well? And then my second question was, Jim and I do a lot in relation to fitness and, the use of these kind of substances outside of elite sports. There is a couple of countries, very few countries, that have adopted anti-doping policies within the fitness industry. And I was just wondering about your opinion as to what you think about to what extent anti-doping should be potentially applied in a fitness context in terms of responding to the use of these substances.
So yes, thanks for the questions. So firstly, in regards to, I guess, the outside influences, yes, that's certainly a really interesting avenue towards that. I think, I guess, thinking about that off the top of my head, there's going to be such a wide-ranging amount of influences. One, I guess, in terms of the culture that the athlete is in, and that's going to be both in terms of potential nationality, and also as well in terms of the level of organization that one is in. Now, research has actually tended to suggest that level of organization doesn't have a significant impact. And that probably kind of relates to the second question there as well, because someone who plays rugby, say for the Dog and Duck, as opposed to someone that plays rugby at a high level in terms of international sport, are going to have different motivations for achieving what they want to achieve, but ultimately the end goal is still, the methodology is still the same. Would be my thoughts on that. So I guess it would certainly be interesting in terms of mapping out a lot of those different potential influences. My work is typically started off qualitative, and then following up that in terms of a wider quantitative model. So I think that would be a really useful approach to doing so. That would certainly be a very interesting project. In regards to the second question, again, yeah, absolutely. I think, particularly within males as well, because obviously we've had the advent of social media within the last, say, about 15 years. Now, women have always typically been exposed to a lot of very strict, I guess, image ideals. But what we're finding now with, say, Instagram and everything like that is that now actually there's a real drive for this ideal male physique to exist, that I don't think has been focused on too much. So from that, like these individuals within the fitness industry that are using a lot of PEDs, especially considering how easily accessible they are now, certainly through the dark web. I mean, I'm actually a natural lifter, and I've been doing so for 7 years. But I think if I actually wanted to acquire steroids, I think I could probably go down my local gym and probably, if I speak to a few people, I don't think it'd be difficult to actually acquire. So I think the motivations from fitness to sport are different, but both are of equal importance.
Thank you so much. James, can I also ask my other question for Jim? Jim, hi. Really interesting presentation as always. I just had a quick question, and that's something I've been thinking about a lot myself in relation to my work. And, as you also know, in terms of, designing and developing instruments and doing research projects, I often also work together with consumers. I, however, find that co-design is, generally a standard part of my projects. I ever find it more difficult to get consumers involved in terms of, being a representative of their group. And what I'm trying to say is, and for example, in Australia, when it comes to other substances, you have a lot of peer and consumer organizations like the Australian Injecting and Illicit Drug User League, AVIL in Australia, but you don't really have those kind of organizations in Australia, at least, and I also don't think in the UK, where there is an organization, where a group of steroid users advocate for certain things or provide input and so on. And so my question is how, and one of the difficulties I'm also coming across is that they often don't want to be a public face, or not necessarily a public face, but they don't want to be, they want to stay anonymous, which makes it more difficult to get them engaged as well. So I just wondering if you could reflect a little bit of how we could improve this to get these groups involved in both the research, in both design, and so on.
I think, it's a really good question. Certainly for our Public Expert Advisory Board, we that consists of people who using gym owners and people who have intimate knowledge of the supply of anabolic steroids, shall we say. We guaranteed anonymity with that, and good enough, the NIHR support that. So we were able to pay them for their time. They were paid as experts in the same way that we'd have experts from local government or from a health organization. So they were recognized as that and contributed to that. So we managed to get that involvement on a small scale. Of course, the problem is, and this goes right the way, I suppose, across all substance use interventions, not just anabolic steroids and imaging performance enhancing drugs, is quite often the representatives are probably not representative of the people who you actually want to engage with, because most people, regardless of what drug it is, they just want to use their drugs and get the benefits or otherwise from those drugs, and that's their business. And so that's always difficult. I think what we have is quite an active hierarchy of influence, in particular in relation to anabolic steroids. And I'm thinking some of those key forums and bodybuilding environments who have a massive amount of influence. And increasingly, as I'm sure you are, we're getting greater traction with them. And I think we are learning to communicate with them far better, and to learn what we can from them, and to, I suppose, get our message over a lot clearer. And this, if I could pick up on something that Mark said, and this is in by no way a criticism of your focus with sport, competitive sport, drug-tested sport, but I suppose for the people who I'm dealing with, there is no fight against anabolic steroids. You know, there is no morality question. There is no legal aspect of this. This is their life choice. Yeah, it would probably be healthier if they didn't use them. It'd be all healthy. We'd all be healthier if nobody drank lager. But you know, there's certain things that I suppose we need a very different approach for this group. We've got that weird crossover group, as you pointed out, for the ones playing for the dog and duck, and we've recently found that out of our anabolic steroid users who we consider not part of that elite sport, around about 20% of them, they find the use of anabolic steroids to enhance their sport a really important factor. It may not be the most important factor. It may be their primary drive is for their appearance, or for their size or strength, or for being an athlete in the terms of being a bodybuilder, and not being an athlete in terms of, say, the IOC. But they'll also be playing rugby on a Saturday, and that's where you get that crossover. And I don't think we had that in the 1990s. We had a very clear group where your anabolic steroid users, some were doormen, and none of them played sport. Some of them were bodybuilders. Now we've got people who want everything. They're engaged in sport. They want to look good. They also want to go out and use psychoactive drugs. And it's a lot more messy and a lot more complicated. But by and large, I'd say for the language that we need to use is very different to the language that you use within your fight against drug use within competitive sport.
Okay, thank you very, very much for that, Jim. We've got a bit of a follow-up to some of the points you made there, which will be, I think, first for you, then for Katinka, and then I don't know if Mark will have something to add. So it seems like this massive expansion beyond bodybuilders and beyond bodybuilders and bouncers is really, really interesting. So firstly, from your estimates, do you know where the UK stands in a global scale? Are we a hotbed? And then when I'll pass on to I'm sure Katinka might have something to say about that on the international level. Then also for Jim, do we know anything regional about popularity of steroids? So when I first, I guess, had some experience of steroids being around, it was me volunteering in a needle exchange in Cardiff. And I thought, well, this makes sense. Everyone loves rugby, so everyone wants to be huge. So maybe South Wales just have lots and lots of steroid users. Is there anything to that? Or perhaps is it that the more post-industrial areas perhaps have more iPad use? Or do you just really, does no one know about that, and those presumptions would be wrong?
Your presumptions are as good as anyone's. When it comes to a global view, Dominic Sago's done a lot of good work around this, but it's only as good as the work that he can actually analyse and bring together. And you know, at one point we thought it was only Australia, the USA, the UK, and maybe Scandinavia. But that's the only places where we bothered looking. And it seems to be pretty much wherever we actually have any detailed research, we find it. Certainly we find in similar sort of levels in countries in the Middle East, South America. In fact, some of the studies there in Brazil are higher than anywhere. So it seems to be maybe in the more industrialized areas, it seems to be higher, but a lot of this is assumptions. But the best estimates that we have from Dominic seem to be similar sort of distribution around the world, but Katinka may have something to add to that. But if we just pick up on the UK, your observations are very true, but it's the same answer on a smaller scale. When we started looking at the new emerging hotbeds of South Wales, parts of Yorkshire, loads of rugby league there, but also the post-industrial areas, and we created stories around, well, this is where heavy industry's gone, and this is people asserting their masculinity, but we didn't really know. And again, it seems to be, it probably is higher in those areas. It seems to be higher in the north of England, in Wales, in Scotland. We're not sure. It seems to be high in Glasgow, but they've got a very good service in Glasgow. So again, it's which comes first. It seems to be we've got higher levels in those post-industrial areas, north of England and Wales. But again, the more we look, the more we find.
Thank you very much. And Katinka, do you have anything to say on those national, regional prevalences, and perhaps anything more on, I guess, cultures and social histories relating to iPad preference?
Well, to be honest, so far I also agree with everything that's being said. So let me then, in terms of adding to that, I mean, yeah, Jim also already mentioned Dominic Segu's work, and I think if you look at, his study, it generally tends to show, I think, that the prevalence, in countries is between 1% and 3%. But Jim, correct me if that is wrong. But I mean, as Jim also mentions, there has been, a lot of methodological. So, geez, it is evening in Australia. Issues with the methods. I'm just going to say this different. Anyway, but having said that, it depends also at the group that you were looking at, and in the sense that, of course, if you're looking at specific high-risk groups, you will see much higher prevalence numbers. So, for example, if you would really focus on bodybuilding groups, you would see that those prevalence numbers are much higher within those groups. So there's one Australian study that found that within bodybuilders, 44% use steroids and other enhancement substances. So the question is also in the sense of, when we're providing, if we want to provide health services, should we potentially target more so these at-risk groups? And having said that, it's not, of course, only about, who is using, but in the way that they're using. So there's also, a Danish studies that looked at different typologies of steroid users, where certain groups are potentially at higher risk of developing certain harms because they're using in higher amounts. They're also using a large range of enhancement substances. They will use psychoactive substances and so on, and they are potentially more at risk than, for example, someone who is 40 and who's using potentially testosterone more so for anti-aging reasons. So that's a little bit about in terms of interventions and things that we need to think about in how to support this group. But having said that, coming back to prevalence numbers, I think also what is really important that we need to think about is that we say prevalence numbers of PEDS. Sorry, I also wanted to mention that I use the word PEDS because in Australia, the acronym is Performance and Image Enhancing Drugs. Well, in the UK, IPADS is used, so image and performance enhancing drugs. So sorry I'll try to use iPads, but I use PEDS because it's more common in Australia. But then at least, the audience knows that I'm referring to the same thing. But the problem is with a lot of studies is that we're focused on steroids, but actually, the word performance and image enhancing drugs incorporates a wide range of substances. So if we actually would probably, but they're all, potentially used in relation to enhance our appearance. So if we, for example, look at women, yes, steroids potentially are used in lower numbers compared to men, but other potentially weight loss drugs which is also a performance and image enhancing drugs, might be used in higher numbers, for that specific group, because those substances are more of interest to women than necessarily steroids, because steroids are usually, tend to use for muscle enhancements, where women are more interested in losing weight. So it's also a little bit here always so difficult in terms, okay, when we're talking about prevalence, about which prevalence, about which substance are we talking about? And I think one of my irritations often is also when I see sometimes studies where they look at different substances, they always mention other recreational drugs to label them like that individually. So we're talking about cocaine, we're talking about heroin, but when we're talking about steroids, we always talk about the term iPads, which actually is misleading because that's a bunch of substances within one category. So we actually should really start talking about steroids, or we should be talking about, a specific weight loss drugs and in terms of prevalence. Sorry, that's what I wanted to add to what Jim was saying.
Thank you very, very much for that. And so one thing quick to add in your list of PIDs or iPads. Something I discovered in my needle exchange days was 3 people coming in for Jabatan. Do you have that? Yeah, injectable melanin. 3 women who were shortly going to go on holiday and wanted to increase their tans by injecting melanin, which at the time from our needs, we hadn't even, this was going back 10 years, we'd barely heard of it. And quickly Googling to find out what the advice would be. So I've actually got a couple of questions for Mark, but I'm going to delay them for a minute while we keep slightly on topic for something that Victoria.
Can I also add to that?
Sorry?
Can I just quickly add something to that, what you're saying? Because you made me think, and that's also in relation to the cultural differences. And I think that's also the point that I was also trying to get to in terms of difference in countries, where, it's also really interesting if we're talking about beats or iPads, is that, it depends also on the values within that country that are important in terms of body image. So in certain, countries, it actually is really an advantage to have a lighter skin. So we'll see that, substances are actually used to lighten the skin, while we're actually in, for example, the UK, we see a lot of substances that are used like melanotan that are used to darken the skin. So it's actually also really interesting to see at, a country and what kind of values they have around body image, and to see what kind of substances people then will be using to enhance their appearance.
Thank you very much.
You made a very good point there with the melanotan, in as much as, melanotan emerged within the anabolic steroid using community for that all over time and diffused to that wider population. You said, young teenage girls using it. It was a completely naive population. Naive in every sense, injecting drug use. And that's where we have real public health concerns of, quite often via the internet, drug use diffusing from one population to another, and that's one of the real risks why we need to have good public health surveillance.
Thank you, and that actually links very well and actually partially answered a question Victoria Silverwood, former colleague. Hi Victoria, hope you're doing well, put into the Q&A. So Victoria asked, to what extent are iPads problematic in terms of both crime and public health? So maybe I'll go round robin, see if Jim and then Katinka have anything on that. And then I'll perhaps pass on to Mark from that. Yeah, what are the harms of doping in sport? It almost sounds slightly facetious there, but so if someone wants to come fully devil's advocate, so what is the problem with it? What are the harms? Can some people argue that you just want the best sporting performance, and people, take all sorts of risks to achieve that? So first, I guess, Katinka, or Jim, and then Katinka, if you've got anything to say on the general public health or crime issues relating to iPads, and then perhaps Mark, add something to that in the specific world of sport.
In relation to harms associated with crime, there's no link with acquisitive crime has ever been made for the use of anabolic steroids and associated drugs or iPads. So that doesn't exist. We know that there's, and this isn't necessarily causality, but we know that there's some associations between crime in particular. There's been a number of very high profile cases of violence, but we don't know the exact causality around this. There seems to be, for some people, high responders. For many people, there'll be increased irritability, which in the right environment can be turned into focus and enhanced training. But for some people who may not utilize that increased aggression and uncontrolled aggression, there may be harms associated. There's loads of physical and psychological harms being linked to anabolic steroid use. But we also know that probably for the vast majority of users, they will have harms that may be classed as inconvenient or that would be transient in some way. For high dosage, prolonged risk, we know the cardiovascular disease, we know the emerging evidence to do with the brain, we know prolonged hypergonadism. So you no longer produce testosterone yourself. So, you know, you have a shutdown and you may need permanent medication, as in testosterone replacement. And those are the kind of big ones. We know for orals that there's links to damage to the liver. A lot of the other things are relatively transient. We know it's dose dependent, length dependent, and so there is some levels of harm reduction, but there is always a wild card. It's an illicit market. People don't know what they're using. It's injectable. There's potential harms with that. We know that there is blood-borne viruses within the population of steroid users, not necessarily transmitted through injecting, but again, it's something that we need to remain vigilant about and ensure that those services are available to prevent any opportunities for the spread of blood-borne viruses.
Thank you. Katinka, do you have anything to add to that public health?
Yeah. So I won't repeat too much of what Jim is saying, but basically, I mean, harms can be, you know, categorized in different ways. So you have the harms that result from the substance itself, and Jim already, you know, mentioned some short and long-term consequences, like the impact on the heart. But there's also a lot of cosmetic short-term harms in terms of, like, for example, developing a lot of zits. But usually when people stop using these substances, those kind of things tend to go away. So then you also have the harms that come from the administration of these substances. So whether you're using them orally, so then it potentially can impact the liver more, whether you're injecting them, which can be linked to risks of blood-borne virus. And then you also have the harms that are actually related to the quality of these substances themselves. So we actually see from a lot of research that the quality of steroids is pretty low. So they're often underdosed, overdosed, or actually, I mean, what you often see, it almost looks like that, the people who are producing these steroids are like, okay, which steroids do I have left over? And then just, put these in their vials, and then, as long as someone has results, they don't really question whether or not the steroid that actually said on the label is actually in there. So you see often that's like this mix of steroids are actually not mentioned on the label. So you have harms that potentially come via different routes. But as I also, opened up with, one of the issues though with steroids is that it's really hard to pinpoint specifically how much harm is caused by steroids, because, as I said, you don't really see those direct harms. You don't see, people overdosing on streets, and it's really hard in terms of, the cardiovascular problems to put a dollar sign on that, to see to what extent it is costing the society in terms of harms. So that makes it also really, really difficult to get this on the map in terms of making governments prioritize this drug using group. And then also in terms of crime, I fully agree with Jim, but I think it is important to highlight that there is this idea of roid rage with steroids, the idea that if someone takes steroids, that person completely goes berserk, and that that basically is a stereotype of someone who uses steroids. And actually, yes, as Jim said, sometimes it can cause irritability. In certain cases, we have seen violent crimes where people have admitted that they purposely use steroids, to get that irritation going. But in generally, we don't see that link in terms of, violent crimes necessarily in steroids. And actually, when it is, as Jim also said, it often is dependent on, personality traits. Is this already someone who is more aggressive by nature? Is this person, using other substances? So often we see in studies that when they look at this link, that the use of other substances, particularly alcohol, is often an important factor in instances where violence has occurred. So I think that's really important to break that stereotype, that, it is not the case that, every steroid user will become violent. And actually it's probably, it's definitely the minority of people that will actually happen. Jim, I don't know if you want to say something in relation to that, or what your view is on that matter.
I agree completely with your summary. I think that for a very small number of high responders, it may result in that, but you can never unpick the personality, the life circumstances, and the psychological, psychoactive properties of a particular drug.
Oh, can I just saw in the chat about domestic abuse. Can I just quickly respond to that, or you want to move on?
No, please.
Yeah, so I mean, I can be really short to that, in the sense that, to my knowledge, but maybe James can correct me, there is I don't think there is really a good research on the link between steroids and domestic violence. I have actually had a discussion with an expert, with an academic who has expertise in domestic violence, and we're talking about steroids. And in his opinion, it often doesn't necessarily play a role. It can occur, that how do you say it, in domestic violence, there will potentially be someone who's using steroids, and that potentially will contribute to that. But it's not necessarily a substance that plays a dominant role in domestic violence. But as I said, there is not, to my knowledge, not a lot of research on this. But Jim, maybe I'm overlooking something, and maybe you are more aware of research in this area.
No, I don't think there is an evidence base around this, but anecdotally, certainly from some police forces, they've reported issues where they believe this to be the case. But we really do need to do more work around that area.
Okay, thank you very much for that. So now I'm going to move that question on to Mark. We'll move the previous public health one, and also give you a slightly double-barreled question. So firstly, with the public health one, maybe start off with my devil's advocate. So what is actually wrong with doping in elite sports? Someone could perhaps say that it is all about maximum performance, and that sports people put their bodies under all sorts of danger anyway to reach maximum performance. So should we allow them to take things further with chemicals? So that's your part one. So please tell us what's wrong with doping in elite sports. Part two, this is a question from Gabriel Riley in the chat, which I'll add my extra bit to as well. So Gabriel says, do the panel feel that elite sports administrators take the issue of doping seriously, or are they happy to simply let selected sports like rugby and cycling take the flak? Hard to believe it's not widespread everywhere. And so that's something I'm very interested in. My main sport that I take interest in is football, as in soccer. And it's so much money, I refuse to believe that the most successful teams aren't up to something in that way. I won't name names to avoid anything litigious happening, but there's a team that Jim might have an interest in, where there's rumours that half of them are, in inverted commas, asthmatic, so that they can get the good benefits from extra use of asthma inhalers. All sorts of stories about fairy tales of those players who recovered their career very late on after injuries, those teams who beat the odds but also suspiciously had no one injured for a whole year. So yeah, firstly, what's wrong with it? Secondly, how much do you think it is a tip of the iceberg that we know about? Since you said the testing was very good, but do you have your suspicions there's a lot more of it which goes on in undetected ways?
Okay, so I'll address the first question first. That devil's advocate aspect is something that comes up quite a lot, and it always surprises me just how many people will be like, well, I want to see someone run the 100 meters in 4 seconds, like, so what I always respond to in terms of that is that I guess when you're competing within sports, let's say, let's have a thought experiment. Say you were either an athlete or you had a son or a daughter who had a real chance of making it as an athlete in whatever sport that you're thinking of. Now, perhaps they're, very genetically gifted, they're they've had all the right training, they've really applied themselves to it. Now, a lot of the problems with PED usage, and I guess I'll preface this with the fact that is if they work. I think I made a good point there in terms of, I guess, the variability in quality of PEDs. Obviously, they're highly accessible, but perhaps Gaz down the gym isn't going to be the best at actually mixing all of his chemicals to make the correct steroids, or the person off the dark web or whoever they're getting these PEDs from. But the problem is that when the PEDs work, like they really work, there's been research to suggest that individuals who have, say, a 12-week course of testosterone have been placed in comparison with individuals who've been put through like a 12-week training program. And what has been shown is that within these studies, that the person who was just taking the testosterone and not actually going to the gym and training, their bench, their squat and their deadlift actually improved more than the person that was going into the gym and putting the hard graft in. So obviously then when you put that into a sporting context, one, your son or your daughter or yourself is then at a severe disadvantage if they're to achieve what they want to achieve. So you're in essence, you're indirectly saying to this person that if you're competing against other people that are taking PEDs, for you to achieve that, then you're placed in a very difficult situation that you shouldn't have to be placed in. And then as well, and I alluded to this in my presentation earlier, is that when you put this into something, say like rugby, for example, now if I don't do the PEDs, you could almost argue that I'm in danger of my own health. These at a very high level, the sorts of G forces that go through, in a rugby tackle are absolutely extreme. Now, if I'm going against someone that's, 120 kilos lean, that's going to be a heck of amount of power that is going to be generated from that person through just the sheer muscle mass that is doing that. So now your PED usage that we are allowing within this devil's advocate question is now in essence, you're going to really struggle if you are not using PEDs. And otherwise, now you're placing an athlete in that situation of do I have a career and what do I want to achieve, or do I go and take PEDs and then have to deal with the myriad of health consequences later on down the line because of the PED usage? In regards to the second question,
before you do that, I think Katinka's got a hand up, so I guess that's a point relating to your response to my first barrel of the question.
So yeah, I'm just wanted to respond to some of the things that Mark was saying, if that's okay. So I just wanted to say, though, I agree that steroids, it's clearly they work. That's the evidence is out there. But doping substances are a very wide range of substances, and I do think that one of the problems, and it doesn't only apply for doping substances, that also applies for supplements as well. There is a wide belief that a lot of things work. Well, there is actually not evidence for them to work, and actually, that's pretty clear that they don't work, or potentially can have a negative impact on your performance as well. So it really depends on the substance. And but the problem is that you create this environment where people are willing to do or use everything that potentially can improve their performance. So despite even evidence, people potentially will use these substances because what if it does affect your performance? So that, I think, is also one of the things that we just, need to also make clear that, for a lot of these things, it doesn't work. And for a lot of these things, it potentially doesn't do anything. And then I think what is also really difficult, and I think that is something that we need to talk about in these discussions as well. I get I completely agree with you. Imagine your own child, your son or your daughter competing and having these forces and potentially feeling forced to use these substances. But for some, young people, this is also their golden ticket to a better life. They potentially come from a poor background, and then telling, for them, they potentially are willing to do everything to be able to become a professional athlete, because they know that that will be their golden ticket to a better life. So it's also really important. Okay, so how do we deal with that? How would we deal with these, these differences in people's background and reasons, and as to why they want to be, why they potentially would be using these substances in sports? And I also think, one of the things that we, in terms of, it's just a question. I'm not saying that anything is right or wrong here, but we do need to think about somewhere about equality in terms of athletes and countries, in terms of the facilities that they have. Like some athletes in rich countries will have much better access to coaches, much better training facilities, much better accessibility to training equipment. So it's there in that sense that also there can be consideration about fairness there. So is it then potentially fair for an athlete who is not, who doesn't have access to these kind of environments, or maybe fair is not the right word, but that potentially, that idea of potentially using substances could become a more important factor, because they feel that it's more fair compared to other athletes that have better access to these kind of things. So these are just, things that are, not necessarily questions or criticism, but things that we need to think about in this discussion.
Thank you. I think your hand is up, Jim.
Yeah, I suppose it's the argument over the protecting the athletes or the sports person's health and well-being, and you mentioned over rugby. If we were really concerned about those issues of the weight differentials, why don't we have weight categories in rugby? Or if we were really concerned about sports people's well-being, why do we have sports that allow people to punch and kick each other in the face? There seems some strange anomalies when IOC talk about the well-being of the athletes, when certainly there's some things that just don't quite add up to me.
Okay, thank you. So I don't know if you have a response to the response, Katinka?
Yeah, so I guess there's quite a lot of points there. Obviously, in terms of Katinka's, firstly, obviously, yeah, I did obviously mention in the sense that, a lot of these drugs don't actually, it can vary in quality, whether you're getting it from Gaz down the gym, for example. And obviously, then if we did actually go and legitimize drugs, yeah, it might be safer in the sense that athletes may still know the dosages, but also as well, that is, is there any way to safely take human growth hormone, and would that still be taken advantage of if we did legitimize that? I think it probably would. In regards to the, access to facilities, again, that's absolutely correct, but that's ultimately the only way you can solve that is by a wide sociological change in terms of ensuring that every country in the world has equal facilities. That's a much bigger issue in terms of world equality than we can actually organize within, say, sport and organizations. And certainly as researchers, we can only control the minimal things that we can control within that. And also as well, as much as inequality is inherently unfair, and I argue this is a very liberal leftist sort of person anyway, there is an inherent inequality across nations in terms of sport and access. It's just so uncontrollable to us, and if we view it through that lens, and unless everything is exactly fair, then what is the point of doing anything? Well, I'm trying to think as well, because so many points that's come up there. There was one other that Katinka made, and I cannot remember off the top of my head. If it comes back to mind, I will go back to it. In regards to Jim, yeah, I completely agree. In terms of these sports, that there is an inherent danger. You've got MMA, you've got boxing, you've got rugby, absolutely. Now, the fact is that these are sports that are 150, 200, if not even older. They're widely ingrained into cultures. Yeah, they're not safe, but like you aren't going to stop people participating within those. And I'm not sure you should. They're so ingrained within our wider identity. Certainly, like in terms of boxing and rugby league, like as someone that lived in Hull for 5 years, like rugby league is Hull. Like Hull's a rugby place. That is, you aren't going to take that out of it. So all you can do in that sense is like you probably wouldn't create a sport that was that dangerous perhaps now in 2022, but the fact is that it exists, and that we should do everything we can in that aspect to make it as safe as possible in regards to the participants that are engaging within that. And drugs is one of those points that they should, if they want to engage within that sport and they want to do it well, that just because you have one risk in terms of, let's say, like hard tackles and that, doesn't mean that the next risk of taking performance enhancing drugs, we might as well throw that to the wind because they're already in danger.
Yeah, thanks.
I do appreciate that. I suppose I was being a little bit, sorry, Joe, I was being a bit facetious around that. But I suppose I was putting the point that if we're appealing to people's fear or concerns around their health, it's very easy for them to justify to themselves, well, why should I listen to that when I'm engaged in risks anyway?
Yeah, so can I also respond to Mark? I just wanted to correct something. I wasn't arguing for
oh no, I know.
Substances legal. The only point that I was making about in terms of effectiveness, not necessarily related to the quality. And I think there's also quite some research about attitudes towards belief that supplements, for example, work. People were more likely engaged also in the use of doping substances. My argument was purely that we need to also break these stereotypes that a lot of these substances work. Well, they actually don't. I mean, the supplement industry, I think, is thriving because everybody believes that all these different boosters and powders are all super effective. Well, actually, there's a very lack of evidence, and it's just, for a lot of substance and money industry. Having said that, I do think I agree with you, and it should be a safe environment for athletes, but there is just so many. It's a bit of a facade because, in a sense that we're always so focused on drugs, but there is so many factors in professional sport that actually make it an unhealthy environment. And I mean, the fact about, I think number one is like, the number of injuries that athletes have and the pressure that they feel that despite their injury, that they still need to go back into their sports. And that potentially then lead to them using painkillers and getting addicted to painkillers to hide the pain from their injuries. So it's just a bit of a facade in the sense we're always so focused on drugs. Well, there's actually also a lot of other things that can cause great harm and to athletes as well. And I think one of the things, Jim also mentioned with contact sports and damage to the brains, things like that have been coming up as to how much damage that actually brings to the athletes as well. So it's just a bit. Drugs is just the easy one to look at. And I just think with professional sport that we actually need to also have a look at all these other things that also impact an athlete's health as well.
Yeah, and that's a good point, actually. So one of the things I remember speaking to a very high level rugby league coach when we actually started off the research for the sport drug control model. And one of the things he turned to me and said is that I think almost that you're looking in the wrong direction in terms of performance enhancing drugs. And I was like, okay, well, this is obviously the benefit of qualitative research. And he was like, well, I was like, well, what do you mean? He was just like, I think there's a widespread epidemic of sleeping pill use within rugby league. And he was just like, put it this way, is like, you go and play for Hull on a Saturday, a Super League Friday evening or whatever, it's live on Sky. There's 20,000 people in the stadium, there's millions watching at home or whatever. And you're going out and you are, going into tackles of the G-force of almost of a car crash several times within a match. And then that match is finishing, say, at 9:30 at night, maybe even 10 o'clock around that sort of time. And you're hyped up and, really important game. You've gone through all of those collisions in terms of that as well. And then you leave the stadium probably at 11 o'clock, you get home to your family at 12, and you've gone through such an intense, important game and so many physical impacts in that time that now you can't sleep. So then you go to the club doctor and then you go, well, actually, I can't sleep. And he gives you some sleeping pills. And then, those work for a few days because actually, you weigh 120 kilos and, it gets you to sleep for a couple of days, but then the next game comes on and you can't sleep again. And then he was like, what players are happening is that they're then going on to their mate who can sleep, getting him to go to the doctor, and all of a sudden now you've got two dosage, 2 packs, 2 prescriptions of these sleeping pills, and then all of a sudden that can then become incredibly addictive. And as somebody mentioned in the chat there as well, it's not just sleeping pills, painkillers, and so on as well, which is why, again, in terms of the presentation I did earlier, I'd be really interested in exploring some of these wider things with some more qualitative research as well. So I do think, as Katinka highlights, that it isn't just in terms of PED usage. There is also very much the possibility that we need to expand what we're looking at in terms of drug usage and sport at high level.
Thank you very much for that. It was about 10 minutes ago I asked you it now, but do you think you could move to the second part of my earlier question? So how much is it a tip of the iceberg that we know about doping in elite sport? And do you have your suspicions about the kind of great sporting successes and the dark secrets that may
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult because in terms of the research in terms of doping behavior, it's very difficult because you can ask someone, but there's always that suspicion that they may be outed because, again, as I keep highlighting there, if you get caught in terms of taking steroids or whatever in your sport, that's a huge reputational, your reputation is tarnished, your entire career is potentially gone. And again, if what you'll often see with athletes is that sense of foreclosed identity that I am Mark, I am the rugby player, I play for Hull, this is who I am. And if I lose that, then I'm losing part of myself. So there's always that reluctance for athletes to admit to doping behavior, at least in a large scale. Now, do I believe, I'm just going to scroll up the chat because I think I just want to have a guide. Gabrielle it was, wasn't it? Yes. So do the panel believe that elite levels administrators take the issue of doping seriously, or are they happy for selected sports to take the flak? Yeah, perhaps a little bit. I think the question that I would put is in terms of do they take it seriously? Yes, I would say yes to an extent, but the capacity in which to accurately catch all of those people taking performance enhancing drugs is very difficult. Testing is expensive. It's incredibly expensive. And then when you look at sports such as I keep going back to it, but rugby league, which is very much associated with high PED usage, there's not a lot of money in rugby league. It's primarily northern sport. And so the capacity in which to regularly test athletes with the highest levels of tests is very difficult. I've been lucky enough to know a few people that play professional rugby. And even at a high level, the testing is actually less than you would think. And the words that I have had said to me in that regard is that PED usage, PED tests aren't PED tests, they're intelligence tests. Because if you play at a certain level, it will soon become quite apparent how often you're going to be tested and when you're going to be tested. So then you just need to work out, say, the half-life of your drug, and then you can work out in your head of, well, yeah, I know the tests are accurate to a ratio of 1 in 1 billion, but if it's not in my system, it's not going to detect it. So do I believe it's widespread in other sports? Probably yes. You mentioned football. I mean, I know you need an excuse as an Arsenal fan, James, but in terms of say a sport such as football, you've got players that are easily playing 45 games, and if you look at your standard fullback, probably covering in terms of anywhere from 8 to 12 kilometers a game in terms of very dynamic sprints that are often changing direction. It's not like me or you running a 10K, which is, I could very much manage a 10K, but in terms of the dynamism of that sport, and you're playing 2 to 3 times a week, you could certainly argue there's a case that PD usage is occurring, and especially when you look at some of those sports then as well that would have the capacity for getting, working with doctors that would know how to avoid drug tests in terms of taking substances that may not yet be caught. There's certainly a huge potential for it. So do I have my suspicions? Yes. Am I reticent to go further than that because ultimately there isn't a huge research base for that? Also, yes.
Thank you very much for that. Katinka, your hand is up.
When is it not? I just wanted to add to Mark, because, Mark already explained really well, the difficulties of measuring the actual prevalence within elite sports. I just want to highlight that I do think that it is depending on the sport and also depending on the substance, in the sense that more sports will more likely have advantages from using substances and from using certain types of substances. So I don't think that the prevalence distribution is equally in each sport. And I do think that it is higher in certain sports. And, the sports that we know is because we also have focused on these sports. So like elite cycling is, one of the sports where we, over the years, have really uncovered that a lot of use is going on. But what is interesting, and Mark also highlighted that point, is that despite testing being very sophisticated, the catching rate is quite low, but despite research showing that the numbers are probably not much higher. But we then also see actually that we're moving a bit away from just testing, and actually a lot of is being invested. For example, one branch I believe that anti-doping is investing in now is a lot in whistleblowing policies, and investing in that way in catching, at least to be able to see if they potentially can catch dopers in that way. And I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Lance Armstrong was also not uncovered because he tested positive. I think he was uncovered because someone told on him. So in that sense, just as an example, that probably if Lance Armstrong, wouldn't have come back after he retired, he probably potentially wouldn't have been uncovered because someone, exposed his doping practices. Anyway, that's another discussion. But what I do think actually is really important, and Mark highlighted that as well, is actually we're so focused at the back end. We're focused on actually catching it. But I do think that we need to actually start looking at the forefront. And I think we need to be more focused on prevention. And there is also a lot more in reports that it is really important that we look at more at grassroots levels and amateur levels, because that's where it potentially can begin. Someone begins to do a sport recreational, starts playing it on an amateur level, and then potentially becomes professional. So I do think that it's really important to actually invest more in terms of prevention and education, in terms of preventing these kind of substance use behavior. Sorry, that were the points that I wanted to make.
Awesome, thank you very much. So we're moving towards the end. There's one more question that's in the chat, which I will ask, as usual, with my kind of follow-up extension to it. So I'll read out the comment from Barnaby Carter, who said, despite there being access to facilities like strength and conditioning, coaches and gyms for athletes, do you think that some athletes are more at risk of using iPads when they are given ambiguous instructions by coaches to put on weight and you'll get selected? There have been several cases within rugby where academy players have been banned for positive drug tests and have indicated that that they had done all they could to put on weight and steroids were the only answer. So where does the responsibility lie in educating athletes, coaches, support staff to mitigate this? I mean, I'll chuck this probably first to Mark. Also, I'll ask you, what I don't know, do coaches and club doctors ever find themselves in trouble, or is it just the unlucky player who tests positive? And then probably to bring everyone into closes, what do you think are the best responses to this? So one thought is that whereas Katinka and Jim have talked a little bit about some engagement services which might run with harm reduction, that's a bit difficult when an elite sports player can't admit it because they'll lose their job if they do. So is there a way to have positive interventions in elite sport? and what do you think the best interventions are? So first, I'll pass that to Mark, and then maybe give everyone their tie-ups on what are the changes you would like to see, what are the best responses to PIDE use.
Yes, so in response to the question by Barnaby, I'm just scrolling up there, in terms of the young academy players being banned for positive. So the responsibility in educating athlete coaches and support staff and so on. So if you remember in my presentation, when we put together I Play Clean, this wasn't solely an athlete interventional program. Now, it was the athletes that we actually measured. But what we also ran with this, we also ran a separate a separate coaches and parents session within I Play Clean in order to educate them regarding PED usage, I guess PED propensity, and also the huge influences I keep emphasizing in terms of the reference group, the huge influence that a coach or a guardian or a parent or so on has on their athletes, I guess, within their care, is probably the best way to put it. So the prevention is certainly better than the cure in this regard. I would like to see more anti-doping interventions that do specifically target parents and coaches as well as the athletes. And again, just highlighting within these young academy players that there are actually other options that they can take in regards to get it, you know, being the best athlete that they can be is always the key foundation, I guess, of any, positive sports psychological intervention. And also as well, we did provide a lot of whistleblowing information to athletes within I Play Clean, so that and we ran a short role-playing session, if you will, where the athletes, you know, learn how to, say no should they be placed within that position as well. So you do have to provide that intervention to coaches and to parents, so they are aware of the influence it can have, and also as well to athletes, promoting those positive self-esteem constructs, if you will, and also making sure that they're aware that if they are presented in that difficult situation, that they can whistleblow and they can say no.
Awesome, thank you very, very much. So next we'll pass on to Katinka and Jim to finish. So yeah, what do you think are the biggest changes you would like to see? Perhaps you say I presume it's needle exchanges, which are primarily kind of designed around the needs of heroin users, and it's GPs, who I presume are the first point of contact or the only point of contact for a steroid user seeking harm reduction or help. So please correct me if I'm wrong on that. Yeah, should that be the case? What changes would you like to see to help iPad users? Oh.
Jim, you go first, because okay. I've already been talking so much.
Okay. Yeah, you make a good point about the needle and syringe. I'm sorry, I wasn't agreeing that you'd already talked too much. You make a good point about the needle and syringe programs. We need to look broader than that. We need to look at the development of specific services, but we don't really know what is effective in reducing harm. We know that a precursor to effective interventions is engagement. We need to, and that needs to be meaningful. But beyond that, we don't really know. And that's why we need to do that research. But before that, we need to, it's not just about harm reduction, it is about prevention as well, in particular about prevention in relation to ensuring that people have exhausted every other possibility to get the results that they want to get before they would even consider using steroids. And to do that, we don't need academics or practitioners, unless they're very big academics and practitioners. The people they will listen to are the people who have built muscle themselves. And I mean, the most effective one that I came across was a gym owner who was a user and was actually a dealer. But if he had a teenager come to him, he'd say, look, you work out in my gym, you don't use anything, and we'll talk about it in 2 years' time. I'll keep an eye on you. I'll make sure you grow as much as you can. And that was, you know, very few of those people would actually invest the 2 years, and they'd just go off and do other stuff. And therefore, that has been primary prevention. You know, you could say that if someone's invested that time and that effort, they've earned the right to use those steroids at the end of it. So there's that, and there's that collaborative work with those people that people will listen to. And then at the other end, around the cessation and we've got hundreds of thousands of people in the UK using anabolic steroids. There's a point in time going to come where they're going to want to stop using. How do we help them do that? For some of them, they're not going to have testosterone anymore. You know, we're going to have to manage that effectively. So we're going to need to develop those services. So it's looking across that life course of the use of anabolic steroids, right the way through from prevention through to successful cessation and relapse prevention.
Thank you. And over to Katinka.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. Actually, really well summarized. So again, I won't repeat what you said because basically I agree with everything you say. What I will add, though, I do think that one of the issues at the moment is that because we mainly see that this group is presenting at needle syringe programs, is that a lot of the things that are being developed are geared toward harm reduction and specifically in bloodborne virus, focused on bloodborne virus prevention. And I do think, I mean, there is some research from Meyer Underwood, and I think also some other people, actually, that when we look at the needs of people who use these substances, that yes, you know, of course it is, you know, bloodborne virus prevention is important, but it's not necessarily their top priority. We also see that things like needle sharing, you know, is very low amongst this population. They might engage in other risky behavior that potentially could you know, lead to bloodborne virus risks. My point is that we need to actually go sit down with the consumer groups and see, okay, what are exactly the needs that, you know, that what would you like to see in terms of interventions, and actually develop more towards that, because as I said, we see a lot being developed in relation to bloodborne virus prevention. And but the thing is that there needs to be a bit of a balance. So a lot of the things that potentially consumers want are not necessarily things that healthcare providers can provide. So yes, healthcare providers can potentially run blood tests to see if you're experiencing adverse effects from your steroid use. But some of, you know, the people I've talked to also said that, that they actually would have like advice from their GPs on the types of steroids that they're using, you know, which is potentially something a GP cannot do. So I do think at this moment that we also really need to sit down with different stakeholders and to see, okay, what are the needs of consumers and what can we also provide in terms of prevention, treatment, and harm reduction. Having said that, I do think also that one of the things that we are seeing is also the point in terms of what Jim was saying, that a lot of people are using and that they currently are not stopping, and then a certain potentially want to stop. And actually quite some recent studies are seeing that the people that do want to stop actually have difficulty stopping and usually return to using these substances again. So that is potentially, I do think that there is an indication that potentially we need to focus on providing better support for those who want to stop using those kind of substances. And I think especially with hypogonadism, that there is an area that could, that is an issue where, you know, once people have used for a long time, and that potentially it takes a long time before the natural testosterone production starts up again. In some cases, it doesn't return. And there is where the risk things are like a depression, or the risk lies where people will potentially start using again. And I do think that that is potentially an important area where we need to start providing more support for this group. Yeah, so anyway, so that was some things that I think that need to be done in addition to what Jim already mentioned as well.
Awesome, thank you. And I think Mark's hand is up for a final sum up.
Yes, as well. I just one thing I wanted to mention in regards to, I guess, moving forward with doping interventions. Now we've seen obviously a wide range of constructs in which can influence athlete doping propensity. I think we're at the point now where we have to start really narrowing in, I guess, in terms of athletes, and providing more individualized approaches to these athletes dependent upon their risk and also perhaps say their personality. So as I mentioned before, like the dark triad is often one that is very used, which is, you know, incredibly interesting. I recommended perhaps looking more towards positive psychology traits as well. Obviously, perhaps athletes that are perhaps lower in some of those things, such as resilience, could be of interest. And also as well, I guess in terms of different, I guess, cultures, both in terms of sports, but also across different nationalities. There was a recent paper by my old PhD supervisor, Prof. Adam Nichols at the University of Hull. And what he actually identified was 4 different types of athletes that can be come across. So in terms of perhaps you have, say, like more pragmatic athletes who perhaps don't like the idea of doping, but are more susceptible, you know, are potentially susceptible to doing so. Obviously, you can have susceptible athletes who perceive very little threat in doping, but obviously see the benefit of doing so. And then perhaps as well, like you have athletes that would not dope no matter what. And depending on what type of, I guess, attitudes that these athletes have towards doping is gonna, you know, be highly influential on the sort of anti-doping education that they need to receive as well. So I do believe that there should be a specific push towards those things. There's been quite huge cultural differences, perhaps say between Australia and say like the UK. So what works over there may not work over here. And also as well, there's importance in order to take into account, say, the sport as well.
Awesome. Thank you very, very much for that. And we have hit 11 o'clock while you've been speaking. So thank you very, very much to Jim, to Katinka, to Mark. That was all excellent. Thank you very, very much. And if we're going the full 2 hours as well, I thank you greatly. And I think we could have easily gone on for longer, but we're all very tired and have places to go now. So I'll also thank all of the attendees. Thank you very much. And all of the backroom people. So Joe, Chris at Street Drugs, and James and Alex at Drug Science. So I will bid you farewell.